Now, how this is going to work is that we have a few questions, and I'm going to fire these off to the panel, and we have agreed that there will be a lead responder to each of these questions, but others are free to jump in. So question number one, we often think of the division between the role of the public servant and the elected official. Would you each tell us what your perception of that division of responsibility was during the Patriation negotiations? And to lead off, Howard Leeson.
Well, are we on? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. What was the division of responsibility? It seemed as if to us, of course, in the civil service, that we did the work, and then the ministers went out and got all the glory. No, that wasn't it. It was really quite an exciting time. I have to echo much of what's been said, a very momentous time. But as a civil servant, you were constantly aware of the fact that you were in a moment of high politics. And you couldn't be the chief civil servant in charge of all of the others who were involved below you, and there were many because we all had great teams of people, as Roy Romano said, but you couldn't be a deputy minister at that level without being aware, of course, of the politics and of being involved in the political discussions as well as the discussions about the various technical points of something like a constitution. For me personally, I think that I tried to keep that as clear as I could. That is that I was the civil servant, they were the decision makers. And it's one of those very difficult things to do, especially when your premier or your minister doesn't agree with you. And I recall at one point where the Premier Blakeney, was doing something that I was 100% opposed to, and therefore I kept sending him memoranda about why he would ask for something, and I would send this memo about whatever he wanted, and then I would add on the end, and here's why you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. Until finally he called me in one day and said, I don't want any more memos on why I shouldn't do this. I want memos on how I can do it. And I thought, right, him, Premier, me, civil servant. And so quite often, of course, the line is blurred. You're sent off as a deputy to negotiate. A couple of instances where I was sent as the representative of Saskatchewan to meetings of ministers. I was clearly not a minister, and I found it very, very uncomfortable to be in there. But just to again echo what Mr. Romano said, it was such an important discussion that you wanted to make sure that your delegation and that your minister and your premier had the very best technical advice available, the very best policy advice available, and at times, if they asked you for other advice, to try and tender it as best you could or to represent them. So I don't know if that answers the question. I'll wait for my colleagues to see what they say.
Don, would you like to give us your comments?
Well, I think Howard has hit the main points, but in Ontario, it was very clear to us that the decision maker was the Premier, Bill Davis. He'd been around for quite a while. He spoke at the Confederation of Tomorrow conference in 1967, which started a lot of the constitutional discussions. He had been very bruised, I think, at the Victoria Conference in 1971, when he thought there had been an agreement. And so that was something that marked his feelings about the November 1981 exercise. He was very concerned to get an agreement that week. He did not like the idea of marching off to the United Kingdom to wash our dirty linen in public over there. He felt that the economic situation in the country was being harmed by the divisions. And we were very glad that the energy situation was largely resolved in September. But it was a rough time in Ontario. Ontario had gone from being third in the provinces in per capita income after equalization in 1973 to being 10th in 1981. And he wanted to make sure that we got back working again. So he was certainly the driver. He didn't always tell you what he thought, and sometimes he'd surprise you. He had two political lieutenants, Tom Wells and Roy McMurtry, who were very useful. One thing about Bill Davis, he'd just come from being the premier of two minority governments. So he was used to compromises, and he was used to trying to make things work, even in difficult situations. Tom Wells had been the minister responsible for dealing with the opposition parties, so he was another diplomat. And Roy McMurtry was an independent, creative guy. Then we had a second level. We had a semi-politician, Hugh Segal, who had just arrived in Premier Davis's office earlier that year. And Hugh had a civil service title, but he wasn't really a civil servant. And so he and I made a deal that he would deal with Mike Kirby, who was a somewhat similar animal, and I would deal with other deputy ministers and outsiders, because I was also secretary to an advisory committee on Confederation. And then we had a very good team of people from Intergovernmental Affairs and from the Attorney General's ministry to provide as much support and advice as possible.
Thank you. Peter Meekison, I'm trying to imagine who would be calling the shots for Alberta.
You heard his name mentioned several times by Premier Romano. Let me just comment on the role. It's a very interesting role, given the degree of responsibility that senior public servants had. But make no mistake, the decisions and advice and instructions, as you'll see later on in the next question, came from the Premier and from the Minister if the Premier wasn't there. But the question was my role as a public servant during the Patriation negotiations. And you just can't start and stop on the week 30 years ago. It goes back, for me, to 1969, but I won't you don't have the time to hear the whole thing. But the reality is that in the period 1980-81, in the summer of 1980, I chaired the committee of officials looking at natural resources. And that particular committee eventually ended up drafting Section 92A of the Constitution Act. So you have to think about the natural resource issue, which was a major issue, not only Roy Romano talked about it in Saskatchewan, but also in Alberta. And as you think, not long after the decision by the federal government to go unilaterally in the fall of 1980, the federal budget came down, and that budget included the National Energy Program. So Alberta took exception to that, as one might expect. And, for example, where the two intersected, as I was involved in both files, where the two intersected was we thought there was questionable constitutionality with respect to the natural gas export tax. And there was a discussion earlier this morning of the importance of reference cases. Well, we had a reference case on that. So the question came up to us, do you want to have, or will you be one of the provinces that goes before the Supreme Court with respect to the Patriation reference? Premier Lougheed said, absolutely not. We cannot put two cases before the Court of Appeal in Alberta, so we'll pass on that and we will intervene on the others, but we'll stick with the natural gas case.
Thanks, Peter. Robert, we'll comment that.
Small comment. I've been a deputy minister for 18 years under 18 different ministers, under 3 different political parties. Therefore, if you start asking yourself these type of questions all the time, you will be at the zillion for idiot people very fast, undoubtedly. The key there is that trust must exist between your political masters and yourself, and you must respect and remember the fact that they are elected people by the population. You are not as a civil servant. They are legally elected, and they are a legitimate government whether they be Parti Québécois, Liberal, or Union Nationale. And that's the framework in which I've been working all the time, and it worked. Thank you.
Thank you. Eddie is going to pass on this one, so we'll move to question number 2. From all the sources that we have, it appears that a number of you were involved in the final hard negotiations the night before the agreement. These must have been highly political negotiations. How much flexibility did you have in saying yes or no to specific proposals? In other words, how long was the leash that you were on when negotiating with your peers? Peter Meekison.
I'd just like to comment briefly on that one as well. Premier Peckford and Premier Blakeney met at the close of the day on November the 4th, approached Peter Lougheed and said they discussed. He came back to me and said, later tonight I'd like you to go to Premier Blakeney's room and to discuss a paper that Mr. Peckford had. So later in the evening, before I left, I said, okay, what's our position? What do I say and do? So he gave me the Alberta's position on a variety of things that were in Mr. Peckford's paper. But the one area which was of particular concern to him was the notwithstanding clause. And he said to me that I want to include in that, because during the conversation earlier in the day, the Prime Minister said, yes, we can see where we might have a notwithstanding clause for articles, the legal rights and equality rights. Mr. Lougheed said, let's put the fundamental freedoms in as well, just to see if he's going to be seriously about negotiating. So we had our discussions among the officials. That led to the First Ministers and other ministers coming in to see the discussion. Mr. Blakeney, when he saw what the Alberta position was, said, well, Mr. Trudeau's not going to agree with that. You've got to get a hold of Premier Lougheed and tell him that it's got to come out. So he was a premier, I was a civil servant, so I called Mr. Lougheed. I woke him up. He said, Peter, that's our position, and don't call me back. Which I did not do. So, long story, but that was our position, and that's what I stuck to. But the key is that he didn't hear anything until the next morning when I briefed him what happened. He had more sleep than I did that night.
Eddie, any comment on this one?
No, I think I'm going to wait for some other things I'd like to say
Robert?
later.
Just a little comment. How long was the leash during that night that preceded the agreement? Well, I'll tell you how long our leash was that night. We were dining and wining in the hall, and the leash was not more than 2 martinis and not more than 4 glasses of wine, because we were kept outside of the negotiating process. We didn't know at all what was going on, so we decided to enjoy the time while we had time to do so.
And cut it short just in case you got roped into the negotiations. Don Stevenson.
Mayor, I think if some of us had known that was your leash, we might have joined you.
Don?
As things got closer to an agreement, I think we all knew where a compromise was finally going to arrive. I just discovered for the first time in 30 years this week that I did still have a file. And here's the document that I see labeled 2:45 a.m., November 5th. Me comments on what Howard Leeson had just sent over. And so we had enough. I awoke, I think, Roy McMurtry and Hugh Siegel and Tom Wells. And we discussed this briefly in the hall, and I was able to phone Howard back. He'd gone, I see by his book, he'd gone to bed an hour earlier. And he says he doesn't remember too much of this call. But these were our comments on the final brief. Some of them got in, I think, Howard. Maybe not everything.
Howard, your response?
Just a quick comment. On how short a leash, I think at this point there was virtually no leash. I agree with everybody else. The premiers were involved, the ministers were involved, the premiers themselves were directly involved in the negotiations, and our job at that point was to either type something up or produce a different draft or make sure a draft was forward. And the only exception to that was Don's call, actually, about an hour after I'd gone to sleep, and he wanted to know if I really thought that Peter Meekison was firm on the idea that the notwithstanding clause should apply to Section 2. And I said, well, yes, I think he is. And I think Peter told me some years later that there was some flexibility there on that. that they might have gone further in the negotiations, but I'll leave that up to you, Peter.
No comment.
So, well, thank you for those responses. Now, Premier Romano, in his comments earlier this afternoon, gave us some of his personal impressions of some of the people who were negotiating, but he made the point that success, if you call it success, and there's a debate about whether this whole exercise was a success or not, but the results, let us call the results that flow from it, were largely based on friendship and trust, and he was not sure which came first. So the next question is the following. Give us your personal impression of the other people negotiating, both political people and public servants. And remember that some are in the audience here today. So Eddie, you go first.
Thank you, Jim. Maybe just wonder if I could start without answering that question and just saying that all of us, I think, want to congratulate the University of Alberta for putting on this conference. I think it's, frankly, I was going to say, I think it's much better. I think it's much more useful and a lot cheaper than spending $30 million on commemorating the War of 1812. But let me try and answer your question. I'm going to say that the short answer is
party's alive and well.
The short answer is I was impressed by some and not impressed by others. But let me speak to it. Roy Romano was probably nicer in his speech than I might be about everybody who was in the room. I told that to Roy when he left. Trust is extraordinary. First of all, what's really important is the dynamic of any negotiation. And you can only have a successful negotiation if there's a willingness to agree at the end of the day. And trust is extraordinarily important. But trust isn't something that was there right from the beginning. And others have spoken this morning and even a little bit a minute or so ago about the fact that it wasn't everything that happened in those few days in November of 1981. It started after the Quebec referendum. It went through the summer of 1980, a very famous First Ministers Conference in September of 1980. And I would say, frankly, and I think he's in the room, and I think I'm known for saying what I think, regardless of who is around, when Premier Peckford at that conference said that he preferred the Canada of René Lévesque to the Canada of Pierre Trudeau, he lost the trust of a lot of people in the room, and it took a long time to reestablish. It took a long time. We had on the federal side disagreements with people in the other provinces. We had enormous respect for somebody like Premier Lougheed. We didn't agree with him, but we knew how strong his principles were. We had respect, frankly, for Mr. Lévesque because we knew he was a separatist. We had less respect, I must say, at the time for those who were either naive or who so disliked Mr. Trudeau that they thought that they could work with René Lévesque. And, if you read Lévesque's memoirs or Claude Morin's memoirs, they both said that their job was to block any deal. So it took a long time to establish that trust, and I think that trust was established amongst officials during the summer of 1980. There's no question of that. And a lot of friendships were established at that time. But the trust that led to the agreement in November was twofold. One, a view that at the end of the day, that other than Mr. Lévesque, people were Canadians and wanted Canada to succeed, despite their political views or their views about Mr. Trudeau. But that trust and that trust was moved along. And I think the Supreme Court, in its judgment, was more responsible for the decision, for the agreement in September than necessarily the relationships in the room.
Thanks, Eddie. Howard, your comments on this one?
Well, maybe not as controversial as what Eddie has said about the War of 1812, but I think there were 2 or 3 levels of trust. The level of trust, I think, amongst us at the senior civil service level was easier in some ways because Most of the time we were not at the final decision. We were still providing alternatives, nor were we going to be responsible for taking that decision. So that Robert and I could meet, we could agree on things, we could work on different alternatives. They were at that point in some ways still theoretical, and we knew that someone else would make the final decision. Of course, some relationships grew stronger than others. I think Peter and I, for example, have known each other, well, virtually most of my adult life, I guess, Peter, and had a pretty special bond during that relationship. Did that affect our premiers? Maybe it did. Perhaps unwittingly I was providing advice that might have been skewed toward Alberta. After all, I was born in Lethbridge. Maybe that was part of it. You don't know these things. We did have a pretty special relationship, and so we could always talk to each other about various things. But again, I understood that there were certain things that I simply couldn't put to Peter because I knew that his political masters wouldn't agree, and I suspect he knew the same thing. But we were these semi-technical people and in some ways, political people. And I think it was easier for us to establish those relationships. And I remember after everything was done, and I had left the government of Saskatchewan, sending a letter to Robert and getting a very nice response from him. And I think that sort of thing characterized many of the relationships, if not all of them. Some of them were not as easy to establish. I think that at times the relationship with officials in the federal government were quite difficult because it seemed to us that their political masters were uncompromising or unable to look at the country as a whole. It seemed to us, some of us, that they were quite myopic and unable to understand the importance of certain issues to people around the country, that they had a particular goal that they were pursuing and were willing to pursue it regardless. But even there, I can still meet with Michael Kirby or others, and certainly with Eddie and others, and still that bit of special relationship from the whole exercise.
Thank you. Robert Normand?
No.
No. Okay. Peter?
I'd like to pick up on Howard's theme. Trust, to me, is fundamental. And when you're listening to other people around the table, you have to take at face value what they're saying and working on the assumption it reflects. Howard uses the term political masters. I refuse to do that, but I'm not on a leash. The thing is that, to me, you have to listen to what they're saying and work on the assumption that they're representing the government of the province. I want to go back to something that Guy Laforêt said this morning, and that has to do with Mr. Trudeau's views after the October 30th conference. I go back to my negotiations with respect to the Section 92A. My federal counterpart there was Gerard Veilleux. And I'd worked with, and he had a sidekick, Eddie, so they were the federal delegation talking about this interest. And Alberta felt very strongly about this. But Gerard told me that, Peter, everything that we had discussed prior to the 1980 election, and we had been discussing resources, he said was basically off the table. This is a very different set of negotiations. It's going to be much tougher. So he gave me a clear heads up as to where and how difficult it would be. Moreover, it wasn't just resources that the committee was looking at. It was also looking at a paper tabled at the conference by Mr. Chrétien on powers over the economy. So the issue there was to debate that along with resources, i.e., if Alberta and Saskatchewan, the resource-producing provinces, want to move in this direction, we want some action on Section 121. So I mean, that was quite clear at the time. But to me, it was that working relationship. When you meet with people, you have your tough negotiations, you go and have a drink with them afterwards. I mean, it's that kind of relationship, and that's the type of relationship I had with all the provincial public servants.
Peter, Mr. Laforêt used the expression, he was quoting, he was referring to Mr. Trudeau, and he used the expression, the hubris of the resurrected, in his comments this morning. Did you mean to refer to the outcome of the election of 80 or the referendum of 80 or both?
Well, I would start with the election outcome of 1980, because that certainly, if you read his throne speech discussions talking about the enemy within, singling out Alberta and Newfoundland, that sort of gave us an indication that things weren't quite as they were before the election.
A wonderful Meekison understatement. Thank you. Don Stevenson.
Well, it was very awkward with some of our counterparts in those days, when particularly it became the 8 and the 2. And some of us were not totally comfortable all the time being part of the 2, because there was clearly a war going on between Ottawa and Quebec. I'd been in various places witnessing the war, in places like the Ivory Coast, where Quebec was trying to establish an international presence, and the federal and Quebec governments were holding simultaneous information missions with all the Africans. It was awkward to be in the middle, and yet we felt very clearly that we were our interests and our long-term positions were much closer to the federal position at that point. I felt a particular awkwardness dealing with Claude Morin, who was such an important part of the discussions. We had known each other since 1960 or so. We'd been dealing with Canada-Quebec Pension Plan. We spent 3 years trying to see if the B&B Commission recommendation for a bilingual national capital district could be implemented. There was an impasse after the first couple of meetings, and that impasse really represented the difference that Morin represented in his views of every federal provincial issue being judged as whether it resulted in a gain for Quebec or not. And for me, it was whether something worked or not. And so as you read Claude's accounts of intergovernmental negotiations from Quebec's position during the 60s, you realized more and more that there was not going to be an agreement. I met with him a couple of times after November 1981, and he doesn't understand why we joined with the federal government, but I think his books probably give the reason.
Thank you. So the next question is is a multifaceted one, but it focuses on the question, was it all worth it? So 30 years have gone by since you were all involved in these negotiations. Do you regret any of the decisions you made, advice that you provided, or any of the outcomes of the negotiations? And I think part of this would be, what would it have taken to get Quebec to agree? And so I would put this to Robert Normand to start us off, please.
Okay, thank you. I'd like first to say that I'm going to speak English because we have simultaneous translation, but nobody has the necessary things in their ears, or very few. Therefore, it's one of two evils. Either I speak French and 3/4 of the people here will not understand, or I speak English with the kind of English I can speak, and at least you will be able to pick up at least half of what I want to say. So I'll go to the... living in Quebec City, I don't have many occasions to speak English anymore, and therefore I try to keep up, though, with the help of Vanna White and Alec Trebek also. So you will have the result. Second comment before I start is thanks to Roy Romano. he was very blunt. He really was explicit. And what he said, from my point of view, not his political comments, then I could have an argument with him, but the facts that he stated were absolutely fantastic. And I think that only for these comments, the conference was worth it today. And thanks to him. I'd like to start with that. He said that the turning point to bring the patriation of Constitution was the statement made by Mr. Lévesque during the last meeting of the Gang of Eight, plus the two other provinces, plus the federal government, when Mr. Trudeau referred to the possibility of a referendum on the charter. And Mr. Lévesque, who was a poker player, as you know, and who had a love-hate relation with Mr. Trudeau. Each of them was searching for the other and tried to put the other one in jeopardy to a certain extent when they had an occasion to do so, on a friendly basis, generally speaking. And this morning, when Mr. Trudeau opened and talked about the possibility of a referendum, Mr. Lévesque, who was a really Democrat, decided, why not? I'll play on his ground, I'll play his game, and we'll see what will come out of that. So from my point of view, it was really a poker move by Mr. Lévesque, but it was not perceived as such by the other First Ministers, member of the Gang of Eight. There was a good trust amongst the people in the Gang of Eight, and we realized many good things through discussions, exchanges of view, a compromise throughout the years. And I think that really, if we rediscover the results of all these discussions, there are very positive solutions that were found there. But that morning, the lack of trust that existed between the English-speaking provinces and a so-called separatist province exploded on exactly what Roy Romano explained. I stopped congratulating Mr. Romano at that point because I think that instead of forming a small group to try to form to come out with a solution that would be shoved down the throat of the province of Quebec was a bad thing for Canada. It was offered to Quebec, of course, the following day, but we were not part at all of the negotiations during the day or during the night. We learned the following morning, maybe there was a phone call during the night, it's not to my knowledge though, but we learned openly the following morning what it was about. And I'm sorry about that, because I think that that's not the way to build a strong country. Canada was not established on that basis. It was established on the basis of consultation, negotiations, compromise, and discovering possibilities, and finally come with a solution. Constitutional amendments were made throughout the century, not many of them, but some of them, but most of the time, I think if not all the time, with the approval, explicit or implicit, of the provinces of everybody. It was not imposed at all. It was the first time for me that a solution was imposed on a province. And I felt that morning, some of my people, some of them were happy because it was fuel for the separatists in Quebec, and it would convince those who were not separatists that Ottawa could hardly be trusted for the wealth of Quebec. And as a matter of fact, don't forget that the PQ lost the referendum in 1980. It had only 42%, but in 1995, it jumped up to 49.4 or 6. So you can see the difference in between. And this decision of shoveling down the throat of Quebec, an agreement on patriation with a charter, without the agreement of Quebec, was, I think, a very sad moment for federalism. And I was sorry that day. Moreover, what we were all looking for was a redefinition of the distribution of powers in Canada in order to improve or at least put the confederation or federation, I think it is now, in line with what the people wanted. Canada had evolved through the century, the 100 years preceding that, and needed adjustments constitutionally. Spending power, for instance, of the federal government should be put, I think, between guidelines more explicit than we have right now, and many others. But that definition that redefinition of the powers, the redistribution of power, was not there at all. And another thing that was very sad, Mr. Trudeau, during the referendum of 1980, told Quebecers, vote no, and I will not forget that, and I will accommodate you after, and I put my head under the axe if necessary. We came up with the solution that we know, patriation of the Constitution plus a Charter of Rights. That was not at all what Quebecers from all parties expected. We expected much more, an agreement with the redistribution of powers, what we had been discussing amongst the Gang of Eight previously. And because this did not happen, and this because it was passed against the will of not only the Parti Québécois, but of the National Assembly, all parties being together, expressed themselves against that move. And people in Quebec felt isolated at that time and still feel isolated from the rest of Canada because of those moves at that time. And it had consequences that I can outline very fast. In the 80s, Mr. Mulroney tried to recuperate things by coming up with the Meech Lake Accord. If the Meech Lake Accord would have been passed, then it would have reconciliated the Quebecers as a whole, not the separatists, but the Quebecers as a whole with the rest of Canada. But since it was rejected, on top of the fact that 9 years before it was put down the throat of Quebecers, then Quebecers got even madder than before. And the general feeling in Quebec is that if Mr. Bourassa, when the Meech Lake Accord was refused, had declared independence, it would have been approved by 70% of the population in Quebec. Wow! This is a consequence of the type of patriation, of the patriation of the Constitution, the way it was done. Moreover, I mentioned the referendum in 95, where it jumped, the yes went up to 49.4. Hey, it's on the verge of a big trouble ahead. And after that, the Bloc Québécois was formed, sending a majority of members in Ottawa at some points that were not there for the whole or the wealth of Canada, but for the wealth of Quebec solely. And this is bad for a country. And this is the result of the type of constitutional amendment that we did. And the last movement that we could describe, the last consequence, is the election on the 2nd of May last of 59 members of NDP in Quebec. Can you imagine? Quebecers don't know what NDP is about. They all voted for a good Jack, that's all, because they were still mad at the situation that is the situation of Quebec. Of course, they will learn what this NDP is about, and I'm quite sure that Roy Romano is happy with that result, undoubtedly. But that's what I wanted to tell you, that it's too bad. I think that I'm not against patriation. It's like a mud or apple pie. It's explicit that when you are a full-fledged country, you've got to have the power to amend your own constitution, obviously. We had not. I'm not against that. But I'm against the amending formula that was put forward, because we have put it at a test in Meech Lake, and it didn't work. And since then, no politician in Ottawa wants to use the word Constitution. It's a swear word in Ottawa. The road is blocked. We're in a deadlock How the hell can we go out of that? I really don't know. If you have good ideas, except that coup d'etat, please come forward. And we also have a charter now. I'm not against the Charter of Rights neither. It's a very good thing. We have a good charter. A bit tough, though, because from my point of view, it should be reassessed periodically to find out what the courts have done with the charter, whether they are on the right path or not, and correction should be brought in case of necessity. And there are some cases of necessity from my point of view, but right now it's impossible to amend that again because of the amending formula. Therefore, we are in a stalemate. We are really not moving at all. So I think it's not very good for Canada. Mind you, these two measures are not bad in themselves as a measure, but the way it was done and the results are, from my point of view, rather bad. How come can we get out of that? As I said, a coup maybe, but no, I think that it will require a strong leadership from a Prime Minister of Canada to do the job, and I don't know when this will be done. I'll stop there, Miss.
If I were a partisan person, I'd say Mr. Dion tried the coup and it didn't seem to work. But I'm not. So, Eddie, I think you'd like to reply. I sense you're anxious to reply.
Robert, je serais peut-être un petit peu en désaccord avec toi. I think I might disagree a little bit with Robert. It's quite a powerful speech that we just heard, and we heard one from Guy Laforêt this morning. Robert told us what he thinks, and he told us very straight what he thinks. I was a little concerned, Guy, this morning when you said that if you were speaking in Quebec, you might say something different. I tell you, I'm going to say the same thing in Edmonton as I've said in Quebec. I don't agree with Robert. I don't have regrets. I have a couple of regrets, and I'll get into those. And I want to comment a little bit on what Robert said because I think it's very important. I've got to tell you, I don't regret for a second being part of a team that brought about the Charter of Rights and all the beneficial impacts, whether on women's rights, whether on same-sex rights, whether on First Nations rights, whether on multiculturalism, whether on minority language education rights. And I don't think Section 23 has, if you look back 30 years, has been very damaging in the province of Quebec. And I don't regret being part of a team that brought forward the type with Barry and Roger's draft and Mary's drafting, that a charter that has been used internationally and as an example for the world, whether in South Africa or in Israel. And frankly, I don't regret being part of a team that patriated the Constitution with an amending formula that people forget. Robert said there's been no constitutional amendments since Meech Lake failed. That's not correct. There was one very important one. There was Quebec used the amending formula. A Parti Québécois government, which says that the Constitution is illegitimate and Quebec isn't part of it, used the amending formula, and they actually negotiated with the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs in Ottawa, who at the time happened to be Monsieur Dion, for a fundamental reform of the education system in Quebec, changing Section 93 of the old BNA Act from a confessional system to a linguistic system. So, they can't very well say, we're not part of the Constitution. We used it once, but, it doesn't count. When the girl wakes up and says to the guy in the morning, don't worry, it's not a precedent. I'm going to go back to being a virgin this afternoon. Sorry, it doesn't work. And when Bernard Landry says, well, it was not a precedent. We used the amending formula. We don't like the amending formula. It's illegitimate. But our reform of education is legitimate. Give me a break. I mean, Meech Lake, and, go back again to 1980. And I said it earlier, Monsieur Lévesque had principles. He was the leader of the Parti Québécois. Article 1 of the program of the Parti Québécois is the separation of Quebec. Last week, Madame Marois, and the 25th anniversary of the death of Monsieur Lévesque, was speaking to him at the monument in Quebec City, and she addressed Monsieur Lévesque and said, "I promise we will achieve your goal of independence." I mean, it's a bit the politically dead speaking to the physically dead, but that's something else. But, that was his goal. And that was his goal right throughout. So, I mean, this was not, we had to understand that. That's why there wasn't an agreement with the government of Quebec in 1980. There was a majority, that's right, a majority of the elected members in the National Assembly, elected Quebecers who voted against it. 72, I believe, out of the 75 elected members by the same electorate in the House of Commons of Canada from Quebec voted for it. So, and the polls afterwards were very interesting. The polls afterwards were great support for patriation in Quebec, great support for the Charter of Rights in Quebec, a decline in support for separation in Quebec. That's the reality. Then came Meech Lake. And how did Meech Lake come around? It was Mr. Mulroney, good faith perhaps, went to his friend Lucien Bouchard. Lucien Bouchard, geez, poor guy, I mean, he's blamed on both sides. Laforêt blamed him this morning for arguing Lévesque's case badly in the Supreme Court, and I'm going to blame him on the other side. But what did Monsieur Bouchard? Monsieur Bouchard probably told Mr. Mulroney, Brian, I've got the Parti Québécois membership card in my wallet. I'm a member of the Parti Québécois. The Parti Québécois believes in separation. And Mulroney said, don't worry about that. Give me advice on how we can bring Quebec into, so-called bring Quebec into the Constitution. Well, he followed Bouchard's advice. The Meech Lake Accord. Today, we heard some pretty eloquent, two very eloquent speeches this morning. One from Mary Lou McPhedran and one from Judy Arola, on how public participation is extremely important in improving constitutions. What happened with Meech Lake? 11 people in private come up with an agreement, and the Prime Minister of Canada says, take it or leave it. We're not making any changes. We don't care what the public says. We're not making any changes. And if you're opposed to it, then you're feeding the separatists. So it wasn't patriation that led to the referendum in 1990, the results of the referendum in 1995. It was Mulroney in good faith. I credit him in good faith. He thought that his Irish charm would bring everybody on side. He appointed a bunch of separatists to the Board of Telefilm and to all sorts of federalist boards. He put Mr. Bouchard in the Canadian Embassy in Paris. He put him in his cabinet so that he could resign at the time where he could create the most harm. That's what happened. And it's the result of Meech Lake that led to the referendum, the close result of the referendum in 1995. If he had let well enough alone, if he hadn't opened that constitutional can of worms, I believe that we probably mightn't have even had a referendum in 1995. So, Robert, with the greatest of respect, I think that there's another side of the story. In terms of the NDP in Quebec in May 2nd, it's obviously a result that surprised everybody. But I don't believe it was, I think it's also interesting to look at Quebec politics today. Quebec politics today, there is a real fed-upness factor. François Legault, who just formed a political party last week for the last year or so, has been ahead in the polls. He'd sweep the province even without a party. And what happened in the federal election is that the NDP was, I believe, on the ballot in a sense in the minds of Quebecers as none of the above. And Quebecers at this time are prepared to vote for none of the above. And it wasn't because of patriation of the Constitution that Leighton won 58 seats in Quebec. So I think that it's important to understand that there's another side of the story. The other point, the last point I'd like to make, and I apologize for taking a bit of time, was and I think it's really important, when Robert says that Mr. Trudeau's constitutional position after the referendum wasn't what Quebecers expected or what Quebecers wanted, or what he said in his famous speech in the Paul Sauvé Arena, where he said, we'll put our heads on the block and there will be change. Everybody knew that Mr. Trudeau, if there was one thing about Mr. Trudeau, is he was pretty stubborn in terms of his principles. And it went patriation of the Constitution, with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with protection for minority language rights across the country, were fundamental to him throughout his whole career as an academic and as a politician. And if anybody thinks that he promised change whereby he would implement the policy of the Parti Québécois or the strong Quebec nationalists, you know, it's just simply not the case, and it's not knowing Mr. Trudeau, and it's frankly not giving any credit to the intelligence of Quebec voters, and perhaps that's why they supported the Patriation and the Charter very strongly after 1980 in all of the polls. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sorry.
Thank you for the rebuttal, Eddie and Howard. I don't know whether we've come to grips with the sub-question contained in this broader question. What would it have taken to get Quebec to agree? I know you want to speak to something else, but maybe you could tackle that as well.
Well, as a civil servant, you have no views on these things. But I'm a political science professor now. Let me just deal with, I think I can deal with the subcontext here too, and that is, I'd like first of all to address something that Robert said about the lack of trust at the actual meeting, the 3-day meeting. And perhaps he doesn't understand that it happened before that. And you talked about somebody talked about the resurrection of the hubris of the resurrected, rather. And we saw that just a bit after the election in April in Quebec, because it was our impression that Mr. Lévesque had been in a very weak bargaining position, and he was. He was in the 5th year of a mandate, didn't look as if he would be reelected, and was reelected. And it was incredible. Everybody was astonished, frankly. What we saw 3 days later was a changed Mr. Lévesque. Suddenly, the First Ministers, 7 other First Ministers who went in, had an agreement with him, thought they had an agreement with him, and suddenly it was changed in several aspects. There was a lot of hard bargaining and a lot of bad feeling, I think, at the end of it on the part of some of the First Ministers. Mr. Blakeney's not here to talk about it, but I think I can say about how he felt. And we left the meeting. Had to have an agreement. Frankly, it was political suicide not to have an agreement on the accord at that point. It went even further then when Mr. Morin came to another meeting of ministers and waxed eloquent on how no matter what happened, they would win. If Mr. Trudeau pushed this through, they would win, ultimately separation. If he didn't push it through, they would win, because the Liberals were then dead, he said. And at the time, I wish Mr. Romano was here, I poked Roy and I said, Roy, ask him how we win. And Roy asked him that question, and he said, Claude, I understand how you win, but how do we win? And he didn't understand the question. He didn't understand the question because it was inconceivable in the fight here that there could be a third group, that there could be a group of us out there who thought that other issues other than the fight with Quebec were very important and should be addressed. And ultimately, as you know, I say it in the book, ultimately, I think it's that third group of people who became important in the whole patriation movement, who put together, if you will, Davis and Lougheed and Blakeney and others who said, here's what's important to us. Yes, we understand there'll be implications for the fight with Quebec. But it was our impression at that time that nothing we could put forward would in fact be enough for Mr. Lévesque. We got that not just from the break on the referendum, Robert, but from the changed attitude after April in these meetings. And so it wasn't a surprise to me then that night that the political leader that I was associated with came to the conclusion that nothing would be agreed to. We could have been entirely wrong, but you make those judgments at the time. And was that the end of it? Were we going to break up Canada? No, we didn't think so, because this was unresolved. It didn't mean that it would be unresolved in the future. Was it selfish of someone who's, and maybe I'm very parochial in this, born in Lethbridge, grandfather homesteaded in Saskatchewan but came to Alberta. Maybe these things that were important to the rest of us were not as important as we thought. But we felt that we counted and that we ought to count. And so in that process then we said to ourselves, yes, maybe Quebec can't agree this time. Is this going to be the end of the process? I don't think any of us thought that. Do I think it was badly handled after that? Yes. As I say in my book, I think Mr. Mulroney badly mishandled the situation after. But well, I'll stop there because I've gone on too long, sorry.
Don Stevenson.
Well, Eddie, I think perhaps the other of us on the panel greeted Gilles Rémillard's proposals that led to the Meech Lake Accord with a great deal of hope, because we thought they were a very reasonable way of doing what Roy Romano said was left undone in November 1981. I guess I have to say that I disagree with you, because I was honored to be the first person before the Ontario Select Committee as a witness for the Meech Lake Accord. I would agree that it was not handled too well by the Prime Minister and others, but I know that the government I was working for at that point was that of David Peterson. He put his whole heart and soul into that accord, believing very much that it would remove a good bit of the bad feeling that was left after November 1981. I agree with you, Eddie, that the exercise that we heard this morning about the women's groups and the Aboriginal groups show that 11 men sitting behind closed doors are not the best way of amending our Constitution. In the future, I think we should be doing what did happen with the Dion, trying out more often the single amendment processes. I think also we should be having a lot more public engagement before the First Ministers sit around and make a deal and produce something then that can't be changed. There was a lot of very creative activity in Canada right after the PQ got in and before the referendum of 1980. We had organized, for instance, Destiny Canada Conference, where 400 people came to live in residence at York University in Toronto, representing by per capita people across the country. We got people, for instance, in Alberta, your predecessor, Harold Milliken, Peter, was in charge of picking a group of Albertans. We had Alan Fotheringham picking a group of 30 or 40 British Columbians. We had a group of about 80 Quebecers, of whom we were sure at least a third were indépendantistes. We got them there. We had our advisory committee, people like Ken Dryden, Roland Mitchener, Richard Simeon, chairing little working groups to try to build bridges on essentially constitutional issues. And it was just amazing how well they managed to work. At the same time, you had the Pépin-Robarts Commission, you had the Ryan Beige paper in Quebec, you had a lot of, I thought, useful sets of proposals that we didn't really take very much advantage of in November 1981.
Thank you,
and
Don.
I think you could do that again.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Peter if he has a point, and then Eddie for a wrap-up on this one. We have one more question, then we're going to throw it open for Q&A.
I might take all the time. Okay. Oh, that's true. That's true. Just a couple of observations. Was it worth it? Depends where you stand. And second question, what would it have taken to have Quebec agree. Having watched not only that conference, but several others, on November the 4th, in the late afternoon, Mr. Levesque said that he thought we had had a good attempt at trying to find a solution. No solution was obviously forthcoming, and perhaps we should now go down and adjourn the conference, admit failure. And that was a non-starter. But it told me at that time it was unlikely that an agreement was possible at that point. Afterwards, Mr. Law, I won't get into all the detail, was concerned in that Claude Morin wrote a letter to his provincial ministerial counterparts dated November the 6th, saying, I enjoyed working with you over the last several months, but I sort of feel that you let me down. And shortly thereafter, he resigned from the Quebec cabinet. Mr. Lougheed decided that he had to respond to that letter. So he drafted a response to that letter, and he asked me to take it around and show it to the other 6 premiers to see whether it accorded with their recollection of their discussions. You have to remember that the premiers, when they were meeting, there were no note takers. So this is what he recalled. Mr. Levesque responded, and that was the end of the correspondence. Those letters were kept private until 1999. No one knew they'd been sent, but they were published in 1999, shortly after the referendum. So you got a different perspective on some of these issues seen by the Premier of Alberta. And I wrote a little forward to it, and it talks about Mr. Morin's comments in May of 1981. But I think Howard is also right that at that meeting, when the provincial patriation plan was being put together, there was concern over the change. And to be fair to Robert, when a lot of these discussions took place amongst premiers and ministers, Robert was filling in for Mr. Levesque and Mr. Morin because there was an election on. And we couldn't get them to the phone. So Robert had to get the message. I don't know whether you could interrupt them during the election, but that was one of the burdens he had to carry. He didn't. Do I regret it? To me, no. I won't get into all the details, but does it matter? To me, it's not over. I'll go back to what Guy Laforêt said this morning. And maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but it may take time for future constitutional discussions, but they will take place. And the Constitution has to be amended. And let me just give you a couple of things. Look at the recent discussions about the composition of Parliament. Before Meech Lake was addressed, the last conference with respect to Aboriginal rights and self-governance was debated. 4 weeks later, Meech Lake was unanimously agreed to. And if you look at the disappointment in that final conference with respect to First Nations and Aboriginal peoples, bitter disappointment at being left out. So in terms of the future, and this was flagged last night by Janine Brody, there are a number of issues out there in the ether that will need to be addressed at some point when you look at what the next agenda might look like. But certain things are happening. Public consultation, that's one of them. But I'll stop at that point. But to me, one final comment, just for a footnote. Going back to the meeting in Mr. Blakeney's suite, it was also clear to me that with part of the provinces, a number of them, there was no appetite to go to the United Kingdom. We had to do this in Canada, a made-in-Canada solution. And that was really a tough choice for them, but that was very clear that they just did not want to go. They wanted to find a solution here.
What Howard calls in his book the Decolonization Imperative. Eddie, just a last word.
Yeah, there's one thing I'd like to say. I mean, Don spoke about Meech Lake, and I know that a number of people in the room here were participants. Roger Tassé and I were law partners at the time, and Roger was acting for Mr. Mulroney. We were delighted. He billed one day 22 hours. But But there was a lesson from 1980, and it's a very serious lesson. It's a lesson of how the Charter of Rights came about. And the Charter of Rights didn't come about by a bunch of people negotiating it in private. The great improvements to the Charter, and we've heard a little bit about it this morning, the great improvements to the Charter came as a result of a parliamentary committee that heard, if I recall, about 1,200 representations. It sat almost 60 days and had, close to 300 hours, 267, my note says, of hearings. And Canadians, including Quebecers at the time, were interested in substance, not process. The elites were talking about the process, about unilateralism. The groups were talking about rights. And we have a very, very, very robust charter as a result of public participation. The problem, so I think the lesson is you cannot have constitutional reform without public participation and public buy-in. The problem with Meech Lake was not the good faith of the people in the room. The problem was not having learned that lesson of a few years earlier. Now, as far as what Peter is, and I think that's fundamental, you can't have constitutional change unless people support it. What Peter said about an agenda for the future, I mentioned François Legault. One of the reasons he's popular in Quebec these days is he said he doesn't want to talk about the Constitution for 10 years. And I think I wrote in a book that there's one iron law of governance in Canada, and that's that intergovernmental officials will continue to see constitutional change as a panacea, and Canadians are going to continue to want to avoid it like the plague. And I think that we should hold off on any thought of constitutional change for a good long time, perhaps until Monsieur Laforêt's conference 25 years from now, at the earliest.
You get stuck in the snow and you rock it forward and
Exactly.
you rock it back, right?
Exactly.
Well, I think on that note, we need to have a little bit of time at least for questions and answers, so I'm going to move to that right now. If people would like to line up at the microphones, we'll take 10 minutes for Q&A. Okay.
On a couple of points made by Eddie Goldenberg, I won't take the one on depending on where you are, what you say, but more to the heart of the matter. The parliamentary committee, first of all, would you, since you credit it, would you recognize that it came out totally accidentally because of how the Conservatives mounted an opposition to the original plans of the federal government? So would you recognize, for instance, that it was absolutely out of the original patriation plans of the federal government? So that's the first one. And the second one, I recognize the legitimacy of the narrative, the coherence of the point you made, which is made by Mr. Trudeau and Tom Axworthy, particularly in the context of the Meech Lake and Charlottetown debates, about the continuity of Mr. Trudeau's vision. So it's a Charter of Rights, individual rights, minority education rights. So that's certainly the narrative, a narrative, pretty much late 80s, early 90s, revisioning what was their opinions at the time. But you accept also the possibility that there's another narrative, for instance, the one I talked about this morning, which is Burrell's narrative, which is that, for instance, as late as September 1980, Mr. Trudeau was ready to consider, and some of these people were there, among the preambles to the Canadian Constitution, something pretty close to the distinct society in Meech Lake. So a number of things with regards to the meaning of renewed federalism in Quebec, which were, as Burrell says, in A Time for Action 1978, in Pépin-Robarts, and in the Livre Beige, so that it was perfectly reasonable for Quebecers to consider post-May 14, 1980, that renewed federalism was not, in a way, as simplified as you've put it, revisioning it or rephrasing it the way yourself, Mr. Chrétien, Mr. Trudeau, and Tom Axworthy presented it in the context of the Meech-Charlottetown debates.
With respect to your first question as to whether the parliamentary committee was part of the plan, the answer is no. The answer is, I'm not sure if it was an accident. I actually wrote in a book that I'd give Mr. Clark full credit for forcing it. But I think that it was, whether it was forced by Mr. Clark, I think the result was fantastic. Okay, and that's why I said a moment ago that perhaps the lesson is you can't force things down people's throats like Mr. Trudeau, the federal people thought we could do probably before the parliamentary committee. So we've got, in terms of where Mr. Trudeau came out in your second question and where Mr. Burrell thinks he came out, I guess there's room for disagreement, but in fairness, Mr. Burrell, I know him and I worked with him. What am I going to say? He stayed on Mr. Trudeau's payroll until his last day in office, and then 3 years later woke up and, conversion on the road to Damascus. He found some principles that he disagreed fundamentally with his boss for years, but he never quit. I mean, I don't call that a hero. I mean.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Schneiderman, Professor Schneiderman.
Thank you very much. First to Mr. Goldenberg. I have a hard time understanding why the federal government would speak on behalf of the citizens of Quebec exclusively. Why would that be sufficient? Why in a federation, when it comes to constitutional reform, you wouldn't want both levels of government to speak to constitutional reform, just as a matter of principle? Because I've heard the refrain about, well, all the Quebec MPs voted in favor. Secondly, and this is to the panel generally, we've heard now several times that, well, from the English-speaking provincial side, there was no interlocutor. There was nobody we could trust to speak to about constitutional reform, about achieving patriation. I'm wondering why, even in the aftermath of the deal, the accord, why you couldn't imagine an interlocutor, why you couldn't imagine offering to Quebecers something more substantive that would appeal to their sensibility over the heads, right, of their provincial government. In litigation, courts, when they want to hear from a party who doesn't appear, they appoint a friend of the court. It's precisely what the Supreme Court of Canada did in the secession reference. To hear the arguments that would have been made by that interlocutor, they're not at the table. So I wonder why, or if you thought about imagining that negotiating party and then trying to envisage a package that would appeal to a broad public and that would be sustainable and not perhaps as dangerous as the proposal that was sealed in November 1981. Thanks.
Let me answer your question, first question, which is addressed to me, and let the panel answer the second one. The first one is, would we have preferred if the government of Quebec had been on side? Of course. I mean, that should almost go without saying. That maybe it did go without saying. I didn't say that. Of course we would have preferred it. Problem was you had a government of Quebec that was not prepared to sign anything because it believed in the separation of Quebec. It didn't believe in the reform of Canada. So I didn't say that the federal government federal members of parliament from Quebec spoke exclusively for Quebec. I said they also spoke for Quebec. That the National Assembly does not speak exclusively for the people of Quebec on matters of like the Constitution. That's what I was saying. So I think it's would we have preferred it? Yeah, but there was a reality there, and it's been mentioned. Monsieur Lévesque himself, I mean, it was a huge mistake, but he gave up the Quebec veto when he signed a pact with the provinces. Why did he give it up? Because he thought that he could keep all of the provincial premiers against Mr. Trudeau, and that it wouldn't really matter very much. And as Robert was saying, he considered himself a poker player, but he played a very bad hand at that point. So there was no veto for Quebec, because he'd given it up. When he wasn't sure whether there was a veto, he went to the Court of Appeal of Quebec, 5-0 decision that there was no veto. He appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, 9-0 decision that there was no veto. So, you know, because you couldn't make a deal with the separatist government, because there was a general consensus that we could move ahead. 30 years later, I don't think that one can say that the Constitution, that the Charter of Rights, or particularly Article 23, or the amending formula, which allowed, as I said, the amendment of the school jurisdiction in Quebec, has been bad for Quebec. So would we have liked it? Yeah. In an ideal world, there are lots of things we would like, but that don't necessarily happen.
So we've got 2 minutes for the other responses. Who would like to respond to the rest of the question? Peter.
Well, David, I don't really know if I have a perfect answer for your question. It's an important question. And it goes back to the morning of November the 5th when Mr. Levesque and Mr. Lougheed talked. I don't know what they talked about, but Mr. Lougheed tried to explain, here's what happened, and an opportunity for Mr. Levesque to say, okay, here's what I might want you to consider. And when we did reconvene, Mr. Trudeau did ask him, well, are there any things that you might like to put on the table? And a couple, one was with respect to what is now Section 59, and the other one is a section in the amending form with respect to opting up for compensation. I don't know if that would have been enough. But the other thing was time. Mr. Trudeau made it clear that after this conference, whatever the outcome, he was going to take it. And so your point, though, of an interlocutor today has some appeal in the sense that, is it too late? No, it's never too late. Because one of the things that comes up in the conference, meetings of Quebec, you hear it. You go to other meetings, you hear it. All right, how do you make it right? Well, it's never too late to start. And a good starting point, the first thing one should read is the preliminary report of the B&B Commission report. That was a fantastic document in terms of where we might go today. One final comment. But Eddie, I have to say this. When you say you can't force things down people's throat, unilateralism was just that.
But it wasn't. The federal government never went unilaterally. It was a good threat. It was a threat. It was a threat, and it was a negotiating tactic. But it never happened.
I guess we have different views.
As Hansard would record, scattered guffaws.
Some members, oh.
Some members, oh. Okay, just like 20 seconds each.
Yeah, 20 seconds. It's not as a rebuttal to anybody here, but we've been using the word separatist many times. I know that in English Canada, when you want to kill your dog, you say he's a separatist. He's a devil. This is a similar, same thing. May I correct the rhetoric maybe a bit? When I was Deputy Minister of Justice in '76 when the PQ arrived. My new minister came in, and I discussed with him the program, like a good deputy minister looks at the program of the party that comes up to find out what he will have to do in the coming years. And I referred to them as separatists. He said, oh, you're not one of the gang. I said, how come? You know that. He said, well, we're not separatists. We're associationists. We're independentists. In other words, they use a strong rhetoric themselves for their own troops to keep the troops hot all the time. And I understand you and the rest of Canada to use the same damn rhetoric, but not to convince them to stay there, but to kill them. Therefore, be careful when you use the word separatist, I think.
Okay, well, we all have to be careful with the language we use, and let's have a round of applause for our panel. I have four gifts here to give, and I was wondering why 4 with 5 panelists, but I think it's Howard's book, and he obviously already has one.
I will take one.
Don, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Eddie.